The anime begins by presenting the protagonist's life in his previous world, where every day he faced the same exhausting routine, going to work on an always crowded train and almost always rushing back home so as not to miss the last departure. His life went on without any changes until, suddenly, he reincarnates in another world and ends up becoming the lord of a remote village. With this new position, he begins to dream of developing that place and turning it into something better. Upon waking up, he realizes that his hand is far too small. Confused, he starts walking around the house, trying to understand what is happening. When he looks out the window, a girl appears and apologizes, calling him by the name Van. He also apologizes, explaining that he was simply admiring the scenery because he found it beautiful. The girl finds the way he speaks strange and asks how someone so young can use such complex words. Even though he is only 2 years old, Van is surprised to hear this and begins to reflect, until he realizes that he still retains all the memories of his past life. He concludes that this must be the phenomenon known as reincarnation. Little by little, Van recalls his new family and discovers that his brothers are named Mersha, Yard, and Sesta. Curious, he asks where exactly he is living. Soon after, he is taken to the dining table, where he finds his father and all his siblings gathered together. During the meal, Van receives attentive treatment from the maids and even jokes with them, thinking that this helps his image. However, while he is having fun, he clearly realizes that all the memories of his life in Japan remain intact. The father asks one of the sons to say what his plans for the day are. One of them answers, somewhat nervously, that he will study fire magic and battle tactics. Sesto comments that he intends to focus on learning magic. When it is Van's turn, he admits that he is not sure yet, but says that he would like to learn more about the culture and history of the country. The brothers are impressed by the answer, while the father starts to laugh, realizing that he has spoiled the boy quite a bit. Even at such a young age, Van shows unusual maturity. The father believes that he will inherit the qualities of both himself and his late wife, Milla, and that he will certainly awaken powerful fire magic. The father comments that he is eagerly awaiting the magic evaluation ceremony, which is held when children turn 8 years old. He has great confidence in Van's potential. The boy explains that, in that world, magical aptitude is extremely important, especially for nobles, who need to master offensive abilities to protect their territory. The 4 main elements are fire, water, wind, and earth, and anyone who awakens something different from these is seen as a source of shame. His father and brothers have affinities with the 4 elements. At another moment, Van asks whether that port is the only one available. The maid confirms it, explaining that there is a gigantic creature in the sea, which makes navigation dangerous. Van shows interest in learning more about the races of that world, surprising the girl with so much curiosity. She tells him about the existence of elves and dwarves. Some maids try to interrupt, saying that such topics are complicated for a child, but Van asks them not to worry, as he simply wants to learn. The topic then shifts to magical tools. The maid explains that certain crystals, gems, and minerals can store magical energy, allowing the creation of special items according to each person's affinity. At that moment, a man appears, slams his hand on the table, and reminds everyone that Van is only 2 years old and is still learning the basics. This man is the head butler. He tests Van by asking him to count the fingers on his hand. When the boy answers correctly, the butler is impressed and decides to become his tutor. For Van, those studies turn into a true torment. Even so, thanks to the intense lessons, he learns an enormous amount in a short time. 2 years pass, and he turns 4 years old. The scene shifts to Van training in combat with his favorite maid. Despite delivering precise strikes, she dodges them all and even mocks him, running away while laughing. Another maid appears, asking whether she is not afraid of being punished for disrespecting a noble, since that is considered a serious crime in that world. To settle the situation, Van simply gives the girl a light flick on the forehead and says that the matter is resolved. For an entire year, he trains swordsmanship every day and is already able to fight on equal footing with older children. Because he faces opponents of a similar age, the attacks end up being simple. But even so, his skill draws attention. The difference between his current life and his previous one is enormous, and everyone is impressed both by his talent and by his humility, despite coming from a noble family. While drinking water after training, Van comes across Dee, the vice captain of the Royal Knights Order. Dee asks to examine his hands and is surprised to find that they are still soft, without calluses. He had imagined that Van trained every night. The boy explains that he spends most of his time studying. Dee comments that Van studies far more than an ordinary child, which makes the boy understand the reason for his heavy routine. Excited, Dee offers to teach Van advanced swordsmanship and promises to make him the greatest swordsman in the kingdom. Van realizes that he speaks very seriously, but explains that he enjoys studying just as much as fighting and intends to devote himself to both. Dee agrees not to push him too hard, but makes it clear that he will be strict. He begins training him from morning until late afternoon, saying that the exercises are light. Although Van is certain that the man has no heart, a maid appears, praising the boy's effort, and Van thanks her. Despite the difficulties, he feels that his days in this new world are fun and full of meaning, something he had never experienced before. He decides to continue making the most of this new life. The following year, Van turns 6 years old and becomes known as a child prodigy. His routine, however, becomes far too heavy, filled with studies and intense training, making him feel increasingly tired. Because of this, he asks the maid to take him out for a walk. He says that he wants to go to the market, just once, so that he can stop being seen as a prodigy and live like an ordinary child. Upon arriving in the city, Van is delighted, as he has never been there before. Till explains that it is the largest market in the region. Suddenly, Van sees a man accompanied by a girl in terrible condition. When he asks what is going on, he discovers that the man intends to sell his own daughter as a slave. Hearing this, Van's heart tightens, deeply shaken by the scene before his eyes. Till explains that when families do not even have the bare minimum to eat, many end up selling their own children as slaves in order to survive. Van feels a painful weight in his chest as he realizes how cruel and unjust this reality is, considering it unthinkable to do such a thing to a child. At that moment, a woman appears and asks whether he is the Marquis's son. She introduces herself as Rosalie, an employee of the Merry Merchant Company, and states that she can arrange anything he might need. Van then asks what the price of the boy in front of him is. Rosalie asks whether the child has any magical aptitude, and the man replies that he only has talent for stealing, claiming that because of that he is worth no more than 3 large silver coins. Angered, the man begins to violently assault the boy and decides to take him to another shop. Outraged by the scene, Van decides to buy the child and offers 5 large silver coins. The man immediately accepts and hastily leaves the area. Van approaches the boy, asks if he can stand, and introduces himself, saying his name is Van. The other boy reveals that his name is Cramson. Van tells him that he is free to go wherever he wants. Till is confused, as she does not understand why Van bought a slave only to free him. Van explains that he did it simply to help and asks whether Cramson has anywhere to go. He then suggests that Cramson come to his house. Cramson replies that he does not believe the Marquis would allow a child of unknown origin into the mansion, but that if he were officially a slave, the situation would be different. Van asks if that would be acceptable, and the boy agrees. Rosalie suggests that the best course of action would be to form a master-servant contract. When the pact is made, a mark appears on Cramson's hand and will remain there until it is undone. Van thanks Rosalie, leaving her extremely happy, as she had never received a sincere thank you from a noble in her entire life. The next day, Cramson informs Van that Dee is waiting for him. Van asks him to say that he is not there, but the boy replies that Dee already knows. Van then asks Cramson to put on a glove, since the mark of the contract is not something pleasant to show. Cramson, however, says that he likes showing the mark, as it represents the bond he has with Van, and that makes him very happy. Van comments that he bought new gloves for him, and the boy agrees to wear them. Upon leaving the room, Cramson tells Dee that Van is not present, but the man swears that he saw Van enter earlier. Cramson believes that Dee only imagined it, perhaps because of the intense feelings he harbors for Van. As a result, Dee decides to take Cramson to train in Van's place. After that, 2 years pass, and everyone comments that Van has turned 8 years old. Expectations are enormous, and everyone can hardly wait for the result of the magical aptitude test. People are excited, believing that Van will become the Lord of the Lands. He is beloved by everyone, as he always treats people with kindness and humility, as if he were an ordinary person. The scene shifts to the family residence, where it is explained that all the children of the clan master the 4 elements, and that Van would certainly also have an aptitude for fire magic. After the test is conducted, rain begins to fall, and everyone is shocked to discover that Van has no affinity with any of the 4 elements. The only magic he can use is production magic. Among all types, this is considered the most unfortunate and despised. A man explains that this magic allows the creation of weapons and accessories using available materials and imagination, without the need for elemental affinity. He questions how Van intends to protect the people with an ability considered useless. The father, frustrated, recalls that both he and Van's late mother always had great firepower and cannot understand how his son could be born so useless. Consumed by rage, the man draws his sword, determined to put an end to it, saying that he was naive to believe Van would be a genius, when in reality he has become a source of shame. At that moment, one of Van's brothers steps in front of their father and proposes an alternative. He explains that there is a remote village that has never developed due to its isolated location. He suggests that Van be sent there. The village has just over 100 inhabitants, is located to the north in a mountainous region that produces nothing of note, and is also threatened by a powerful demonic beast. Nearby lies the territory of Count Ferdinand, and on the other side is the kingdom of Uranetta. The value of that village is minimal, being used only as a support point for training expeditions. It is a recently acquired territory whose loyalty to the Marquis's family is weak. If someone from the family were to take command, even symbolically, its prestige would increase. The father then decides to leave Van in the care of the strongest man in the village, and orders that he depart as soon as everything is prepared. He then leaves the room. The brother apologizes to Van, saying that it was the only possible solution. The news spreads quickly, and everyone is saddened by the boy's departure. Many people like him, and even Dee decides to accompany him to teach him everything he knows about magic. Van asks whether a knight can really go along, but Dee assures him that there is nothing to worry about, because wherever Van goes, he will go as well. The head butler decides to retire and accompany Van, saying that he will have a lot of fun helping him. With no other option, Van accepts that everyone will go with him. Till asks if he is all right, since he seems to be smiling so much. As he leaves the city, the people are saddened but accept the decision and wish Van good luck in his new life. The boy feels happy knowing that he has so many people he can trust. Thus ends the first episode. During the journey to the new city, the protagonist shows everyone that he has a great affinity with production magic. He wishes that this type of magic had some practical use, and after a long journey, they finally begin to approach the village where they will live from now on. The boy asks Kamzan not to push herself beyond her limits and says that, if she is already tired, she can return home without any problem. If he asked his brother for help, he would certainly take care of Van, but that does not matter to him. He promised to spend the rest of his life by Van's side, and he intends to keep that promise. He says that he will always be by the boy's side and that he would even put his own life on the line for him. Van becomes extremely embarrassed and asks if that sounds like a marriage proposal. The boy answers directly that he loves Van. Even finding the situation strange, he decides to continue the journey. However, without any warning, the carriage stops abruptly. When they look ahead, they realize that the village is facing serious problems and is under attack. Van quickly gathers his companions to set up a strategy and try to retake the village. Den comments that it is probably a group of bandits attacking the place. Van notices that the village is surrounded by archers on all sides, but strangely the arrows do not seem to have any effect at all. In front of the gate, there are many people gathered, while the villagers can only hide, unable to react. Making a quick estimate, Van calculates that there are about 50 enemies, a number far greater than theirs. Den suggests advancing and facing the attackers, believing that if they work together, they can win. One of the men considers this risky, since they are outnumbered. Den replies that he understands the risks, as he has been on the front lines many times. He knows that there will be wounded and even dead, but he believes that there is still a way to fight the enemy. One of the adventurers reminds them that they were hired only to escort them to the city and will not accept missions that put their companions at mortal risk. Den explains that that village is the first territory of his lord and shelters the first people under his rule. He asks when they intend to draw their swords. If not in a critical situation like that, the adventurer acknowledges Den's sense of honor, but states that this does not apply to them, as they are just adventurers. Even understanding this, Den asks that they at least protect Van. The butler, however, objects. He says that if Den dies, there will be no future, even if the village is recovered. Despite his age, he reveals that he is a mage of the 4 elements, surprising everyone. He explains that he will start by raising a barrier, while the adventurers attack from a distance behind it. When the enemies turn their attention to the barrier, D and his men will attack from the flanks. With coordinated surprise attacks, the chances of victory will be high. Van asks if the butler intends to fight as well. He replies that yes, because if he does not continue the attack, he will end up serving only as bait and D, and the others will die in vain. Van refuses to accept the death of his butler, but he insists, saying that his old eyes can still be useful and asks Van to accept this wish. Van objects again, reminding him of how much he has contributed to the Marquis family. He also asks D not to take risks, as they are still part of the main order of knights. If they lose D, who has great combat power, and the group's strategist, the territory will not be able to develop. Van then offers to serve as bait, but his maid refuses to allow that. Kamzan also volunteers to draw the enemy's attention. Van explains that he could not bear to see someone he loves die and says that Kamzan must live as long as possible, since she is now free. He decides to advance mounted on the carriage, attacking from the front, while the others carry out long-range attacks from the sides. Even facing resistance, Van states that he trains swordsmanship intensively every day with the vice commander of the knights, and will not die so easily. In his thoughts, he believes that even if he dies, it would be honorable for a lord to give his life for his people. He asks that they discard his body and not reveal his name, so as not to cause problems for the Marquis family. The scene shifts to the adventurers talking, saying that they have never met truly good nobles, only arrogant ones. One of them asks why he accepted the mission, and he replies that he intends to remain for a long time in the territory of Marquis Feltio. Van suddenly appears, thanking him for having accepted the job. After that, the man admits that perhaps there are exceptions among nobles. Returning to the present, the adventurer decides to accept fighting on the front line, this time entrusting his life to Van. Even with the boy's reluctance, he explains that if a child is willing to risk his own life, he cannot refuse. His companions agree, saying that they have always mocked the nobility, but have never met someone who remembered everyone's name like Van. Because of that, they believe they can trust him. Den also decides to advance, because protecting Van there is protecting the future of the Marquis family. Espada follows along, stating that as the lord of the lands, Van cannot act so recklessly and needs to understand the weight of being an heir. Thus, he adjusts the strategy, first the barrier, long-range attacks, D on the left and Ortho on the right. One of the adventurers observes the mage's power and is impressed. Another comments that if he had refused, he would have been willing to risk his own life in his place. He says that Van is a big fish and that, if possible, he would like to see him become king. Soon, the invaders begin to be attacked from behind, falling one after another. Confused, they try to react, but D advances with his companions, defeating many enemies with ease. Just with his aura, D makes many of them flee. One fighter tries to attack the support group and almost hits one of the women, but Van steps forward, cuts the enemy's legs, and Kamzan finishes the attack. Van warns that there may be more enemies in that area and asks for extra caution. The woman, in shock, looks at the boy and wonders what kind of child that is who has just saved her. After some time, all the enemies present in the area are subdued and captured, without anyone getting hurt. As soon as the adventurer receives the agreed reward, the mission will be considered complete. However, he begins to show a certain interest in Van. Maybe this will not bring money, but he seriously considers staying in that place. One of the members says that he cannot stay because he already has a fixed job elsewhere. The woman, however, decides to remain since she was directly saved by Van. The others also choose to stay because they realize that he is different from all the other nobles they have known throughout their lives. In addition to still being just a child who has not even turned 10 years old, they want to closely follow what kind of person he will become in the future and decide to help him for a while. Van ends up being scolded by his maid, who says that if he intends to risk his own life in that way, he should use hers as bait instead of his, asking him to never commit such reckless actions again. At that moment, Dee appears telling everyone that it was an excellent victory. Espada observes that the villagers seem to all be gathered in front of the village gate. When they enter the place, Van introduces himself as the new lord of the village. But it soon becomes clear that the place is in terrible condition. An elderly man explains that he is the village chief and deeply thanks them for having been saved. Van asks if attacks like that have happened before, and the old man confirms, saying that just in that year the village was attacked several times. Van then questions why the village is so targeted, and the chief replies that in the time of Count Ferdinand, there was an order of knights that patrolled the region, but that no longer happens. Van understands that after the Marquis took over that area, the village began to run a serious risk of disappearing. He shows regret over his father's actions and believes that he does not know the real situation of the place, since, for paying few taxes, the village is not considered a priority for the nobles. Van explains that it is no use just complaining about the current condition of the kingdom. The village chief questions whether they really should hear this coming from a noble. Van asks everyone to calm down, stating that he is talking about the future of the village. He acknowledges that the responsibility of the nobility is great, and that, if they analyze the causes, there were probably failures in the laws established by the Berlinet royal family, founder of the kingdom. However, changing the laws of a kingdom is not a simple matter. Therefore, he asks if they know what to do besides just complaining. Van then presents 3 possible measures. The first is to create value for the village, making it impossible for the kingdom to ignore it. The second is to guarantee a constant source of income to hire mercenaries. The third is to reform and develop the village on their own. One of the residents explains that they have already tried to improve the village by themselves, but that it was not easy at all. Van replies that he understands the difficulties, but reinforces that now he is the lord of those lands and will not allow his people to starve. Even so, few show immediate hope. At that moment, Espada decides to speak. He explains that he served as head butler of the house of Marquis Ferdio and states that Van is an extremely talented young man, having been appointed lord of the lands at only 8 years old. He says that he was always treated as a prodigy. He also explains that Dee came to act as the village guard. From that point on, the villagers begin to create great expectations, since such important people are now there. One of the men asks if Van also masters the 4 elements. Van asks them not to create exaggerated expectations regarding his magic, saying that he can help in other ways. He himself recognizes that he still does not fully know his own abilities. A resident asks about the taxes, which are around 30%. Van decides to reduce it to only 10% of the harvest for a while, as he considers it essential to first guarantee a stable life for everyone. This decision greatly cheers the villagers. Van decides that the first step will be to reinforce the village walls and asks if anyone can help with that. A man replies that he can use earth magic, but that over time the structure will become just an ordinary wall. Van considers this sufficient for now and asks him to do it. The man performs the magic, leaving everyone impressed with his strength. Van thinks it is better to delay possible new attacks, but Dee says to leave that to them, as they will prepare several traps. Van asks everyone to cooperate, stating that if they work together, the village will certainly prosper. Upon leaving the village, Van decides to test his production magic to create something durable. One of the adventurers tries to break the object with his sword, but cannot, surprising everyone. At nightfall, a girl asks if Van's magic does not run out. He replies that he cannot perceive this limit, explaining that production magic consumes a great deal of magical power and that it is normally difficult to create even a single item. The next day, Van decides to build a house. Over time, he also intends to organize a harvest festival or something similar to a carnival. He wonders if he can really create an entire house with his power. But after imagining the result, he ends up building a large house in a short time, leaving everyone around impressed with his ability. Thus ends the second episode. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you next week with this same anime. See you later. Soon after, everyone ends up becoming extremely amazed by the creation ability that is displayed. Van likes this talent he possesses quite a lot, but he believes that offensive magic, capable of protecting the territory, might be the better choice. For him, having that kind of power is important precisely because he needs to defend his people. Even so, the people ask him not to think that way, stating that they would rather live in the boys' lands than under Jalpa's rule. At that moment, the butler appears and comments that Van is not wrong. Still, he emphasizes that what the people truly desire is a lord capable of improving their lives. Because of that, there is no one more suitable for this role than Van himself. Den agrees with these words, saying that he never imagined the boy would be capable of building a house in such a short amount of time. The adventurers are also surprised by Van's strength, as they realize that his power far surpasses ordinary production magic used on a large scale. Van simply asks everyone to bring wood, explaining that if they do so, he will be able to create houses for them as well. With that, both sides begin to feel motivated, eager to build their own homes as soon as possible. Suddenly, the villagers ask whether Van would also be able to make houses for all of them, as long as they provided the necessary wood. They explain that wind comes in through the walls and that there are many leaks whenever it rains. Van understands that this will require a great deal of time and will be very exhausting, but he knows that he needs to do this for his people, since the houses are practically falling apart. Thus, he decides to begin a major change in the village's life. The boy resolves that he will build one house for each family. Van believes that if his production magic can make everyone happy, then this is the right path to follow. After some time, he is already building new houses throughout the village and renovating those that still had some chance of being saved. Some were in terrible condition, but even so, Van manages to make them look brand new. After that, everyone is impressed by the boy's magical powers. Van explains that all of this is just basic knowledge. He comments that the houses were organized into groups of 4, with wide streets laid out in a grid pattern. The family homes were made in a standardized way, so that there would be no differences between them. This is enough for now, but he says that in the future, when he obtains better quality stone, he intends to rebuild every house once again. The villagers are very happy with these improvements. In addition, Van also builds a simple bathhouse next to his mansion. He only wanted to take a peaceful bath, but he is pleased to see that everyone liked the idea. The construction was easy. He asked Pluriel to use water magic to fill the tub and Kamzen to heat the water with fire and firewood. The girls suggest that Van bathe together with them, but the boy becomes embarrassed and prefers to refuse. When they go inside, they are enchanted by the place. One adventurer comments that she never imagined Van would treat the villagers with such comfort. His maid states that Van is an incredible noble and that she could list his qualities without even having to think. After that, it is Van's turn to bathe together with his friend. During the moment, Van notices that the boy is already developing muscles and ends up feeling a bit envious. His friend replies that, compared to D, this is still nothing. Van comments that next to D, everyone looks weak. Suddenly, a man appears asking if he was called. Van tries to leave, but the man asks him to wait, saying that they will bathe together. After a relaxing bath, Van decides to go to sleep early so that he can work again the next day. At dawn, Van gets up and, together with the knights, begins creating a moat. He decides that the place will serve both for bathing and as a source of drinking water. For that, he uses his sword, which pierces dozens of meters in a single strike. D, Kamzen, and the others begin digging manually, while Van follows behind reinforcing the soil and the walls. Van notices that D continues working while laughing, full of energy, and becomes curious about the reason. Espada also wonders about this, since D is close to 40 years old and still shows so much stamina. Van understands that the work can be fun because they are helping people and, by doing so, can attract merchants to the village in the future, something essential for a comfortable life. In the afternoon, Van thinks it is better to interrupt the work, but Dee prefers to continue. Since they are almost reaching the village, Van asks Dee to watch over his helpers, as many of them are exhausted. Dee believed that he had created a good training method, but ends up being warned that overdoing it like this is not a good idea. Van is startled to realize that Dee still has plenty of energy left. On the next day, after a great deal of effort, they finally manage to complete everything in just a few days. Van asks Espada to open the passage, and when that happens, everyone is amazed by the result. No one imagined it would turn out so well. The villagers rejoice, because now there is plenty of water in the village. Although there is concern that if it rains too much, the level could rise and cause flooding. Van suggests building a lake behind the village, and Espada agrees, saying that it can serve as a reservoir during times of drought. After some time, they manage to do this with ease. The old man is very satisfied, because thanks to Van it will no longer be necessary to go to the river to fetch water. Van also feels happy for finally having abundant water in the village. On the next day, he manages to improve the wall, combining earth and stone to make it as durable as concrete. Everyone feels relieved, because even if thieves appear, they will be protected. Van decides to reinforce security even further and builds a simple ballista. With a shield in front, it can block attacks while allowing retaliation with bolts. People are impressed to realize that Van's magic can create practically anything. He knows that the village is small, but now it is far better than before. Espada also feels more at ease, since ordinary thieves will not be able to invade the place. Dee comments that if Jalpa had seen this power earlier, the Marquis family would have grown greatly with Van as either lord or assistant. Espada asks him not to say that, reminding him that the head of the family always valued combat power more. Dee replies that Van's power is more than sufficient for fighting, perhaps even greater than anyone else's. Espada tells him not to exaggerate, since Van's strength is not aimed at direct attacks. Dee explains that war is not limited to attacking alone, but also involves strategy. Van ends the discussion by saying that there is no point in comparing talents, because everyone should simply do their best with what they have. Soon after, the boy's stomach growls, and his maid decides to prepare a good meal. When they arrive home, she comments that there are not many things to do. Espada then explains that it is useless to focus only on protecting the village if it does not have a steady source of income. Currently, at best, only a traveling merchant appears once a month, and there is almost no trade with the outside world. Van believes that this is enough, since he can create furniture with his magic and live off what they produce in the fields. Espada argues that, this way, it will not be possible to make the sweets that Van likes so much. The boy gets irritated by that and decides that he will make something to sell in the village. As he goes outside, Van begins to look for ideas and resources that can be used to develop the place. Suddenly, one of the adventurers appears, saying that he had bought a shield, but when he touched it lightly with a wooden sword, the object ended up splitting in half. Even so, using his power, Van manages to reinforce it and make it even more durable than before. Soon after, the same adventurer asks Van whether he would be interested in buying minerals, explaining that in that forest, possibly because it lies at the foot of the Wolfsburg Mountains, there are many powerful magical beasts. Perhaps because of that, it is possible to collect rare minerals without the need to climb up into the mountains. They found iron, as well as copper, silver, and even some gold. To everyone's surprise, they also managed to find mithril. Van is amazed that they found this type of mineral in that region and asks why the place had never been explored before. The adventurer replies that the area is remote, and that, for outsiders, it does not seem worth the risk to go there. He imagines that the only explorations carried out in the past were done by knights. With that, Van realizes that there may be many other resources around the village. Curious, he asks if he can use some of the iron they found. After receiving permission, he manages to purify it with ease. Everyone is impressed and asks whether he would be able to forge a sword. After concentrating, Van creates one without any difficulty, leaving everyone excited, and they soon begin asking whether he could also make something for them. At that moment, Espada appears at the site and, upon realizing that they found mithril, comments that it is extremely rare to find that mineral in a forest. He says that this would only be common if there were a dungeon nearby. The adventurer asks whether there is a dungeon in that region, but Espada replies that he does not know. He explains that if there is a dungeon nearby, the situation would change completely. Many people would start passing through the village, along with goods. Van understands that if they find a dungeon, the importance of the village will increase significantly. Dungeons are considered true national treasures, filled with valuable resources such as clothing, jewelry, and other rare items. Normally, when a guild receives news of the discovery of a new dungeon, a rule determines that branches must be opened in nearby cities and villages. Even so, Van knows that, at the moment, the village would not be able to accommodate so many adventurers. Espada agrees, saying that it would not be only adventurers who would appear, but also merchants and even warriors. In addition, Van understands that neighboring countries might try to attack the region in search of profit. Because of this, they conclude that it is best to expand the village as soon as possible. If this is done quickly, no one from Van's family will be able to interfere. Thus, they decide that it is not a good idea to look for a dungeon for now. Upon returning home, Van receives the news that armored lizards are approaching the village. The boy immediately orders the gate to be raised. Then, he asks for everyone's help to protect the place and keep the village standing. With that, another episode comes to an end. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and if you did, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Bye. The boy asks D to use the ballista as quickly as possible to contain those creatures. The guards explain that the beast's resistant carapace makes common weapons cause almost no damage. D already knows that. Even so, he has taken part in battles that seem to lead to total destruction, and even then, emerged victorious in all of them. Now, however, he decides to follow Van's guidance. For that reason, he orders the ballistas to be loaded with arrows immediately. When he fires, D is surprised to see that the arrow pierces through the monster's body. Even with its extremely tough skin, they ask for more ammunition, as there is only one arrow left for each ballista. D grows tense, aware that the situation could worsen quickly, and demands that they reload as soon as possible. Van begins to think about what he can do to help, since the second wave of enemies has been defeated and the arrows have run out. Then, he suggests the use of wooden arrows. The knights look at one another, confused, not understanding how that would work. Even so, D asks them to trust Van, reminding them that the boy has already surprised him many times. He recalls that Van protected the village from bandits and made it grow at an impressive pace. For that reason, he places complete trust in him. D then orders them to load the ballistas with wooden arrows and prepare to fire. When they shoot, the armored beasts fall one after another, leaving everyone shocked. Excited, they continue the attack, joking that if they win, they will celebrate with lizard skewers. In a short time, all the creatures are defeated with unexpected ease. The knights report that the enemy has been completely eliminated, with no serious casualties, only one lightly injured. In the end, few arrows were necessary. D feels satisfaction with such an absolute victory that it almost seems too easy. He is certain that Van will still become someone great. After that, everyone begins to remove the lizard's hides, carefully preserving eyes and fangs. The internal organs are not useful, but they make sure to extract the magical cores. The enormous amount of meat would normally spoil before the end of processing. However, thanks to the handmade knives made by Van, the work proceeds without difficulty. Seeing so much meat gathered, Van decides that the best option is to organize a festival, celebrating the first great victory under his leadership. Everyone becomes excited, since after a long time they are able to eat quality meat and drink good beer. The old man watches the scene, amazed, because he never imagined that a noble like Van would be there laughing and celebrating together with them. Espada realizes that this could cause problems, but acknowledges that Van is simply like that. The adventurers are also surprised by the flavor of the armored lizard meat. Suddenly, D receives the news that Van distributed swords to all the adventurers, except to him. Soon after, the knights also begin to ask Van for weapons. The boy explains that he cannot accept their money now, but that as soon as he obtains more materials and the village's financial support, he will make swords for everyone. They comment that if they sold the armored lizards to merchants, each one could yield around 20 gold coins. However, this time, a large part of the meat would end up spoiling. Since the meat cannot be sold and transportation costs are high, the final value would drop to about 8 coins per piece. Van calculates that there are 40 lizards, which would yield more than 300 gold coins. Espada reminds him that if a village obtains more than 100 coins, half must be handed over to the Marquis's family. Van asks if it would not be possible to keep this a secret, but Espada says that, with such a large quantity, it would be discovered quickly. Van does not care that much, but he knows that his father will end up finding out about the situation. If the village proves to be profitable, it may be transferred to another region, and he will no longer be able to live peacefully there. Espada admits that hiding it is difficult, but suggests a solution. He asks Van to inform Mersha, the older brother. That way, they could say that it was Mersha who defeated the beasts, since he desires a title to make his father proud. It would be a perfect story for both. Sometime later, traveling merchants arrive at the location, and one of them is surprised to realize that this really is the frontier village. Soon after, Van appears and introduces himself as the lord of the village. Everyone is shocked to discover that he is the fourth son of the Marquis's family. They do not understand how someone considered a great prodigy ended up in such a remote place. Upon entering the village, they are impressed by the enormous amount of lizard meat stored there. They ask if it was Van who defeated all those armored lizards, creatures feared by many adventurers because of their extremely hard scales. Van asks if they intend to buy, and the merchants reply that they do, saying they will gather more people from the company. They ask if they can return in about a month. Van says that there is no problem, but warns that the meat will not last that long and offers part of it for free. Next, he asks if they would like to see the swords the village is producing, and whether they could promote the sale. The merchants become uneasy, as they intended to keep exclusivity, and are surprised when Van notices this. He explains that it is possible to sell even with other interested parties and suggests that they open a shop in the village. With more sellers, profits would increase. As soon as they decide, Van builds the shop quickly, leaving everyone amazed by his skill. He says that he is counting on them from that moment on. Soon after, 2 girls appear in front of the village, clearly dissatisfied with what is happening. One of them decides to approach to better understand the situation. The scene shifts to Espada suggesting that Van think about building a city capable of housing 10,000 people, as they need to plan for the future. Van asks if 1,000 would not be enough, but Espada replies that it would not. Considering the village's rapid pace of growth, many people will be needed to manage everything and ensure security. Van agrees and asks what kind of fortress Espada imagines. The man explains that cities with square walls are common, but Van prefers a star-shaped design. That way, attackers would have to conquer the corners before reaching the center, and even if they tried to scale the walls, they would be attacked from 3 sides. Espada acknowledges that it is a very well thought out idea. At that moment, news arrives that emissaries from the neighboring land, ruled by Count Ferdinand, are on their way. Van introduces himself, and the blonde woman identifies herself as Panamera Carrera Cayenne, appointed Viscountess after receiving the title of knight. The other introduces herself as Alt, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinand, saying that her father asked her to greet Van. The boy thanks them, saying that he is grateful they came to such a distant village. Observing him, Panamera notices that Van is younger than Alt, yet appears far more mature. She asks if he knows the reason for their visit. Van replies that he imagines they are there to observe the enemy and attempt a reconciliation. The girl starts laughing, surprised by the reasoning of a child of only 8 years old, and confirms that he is completely right. Lord Ferdinand deeply distrusted the boy to whom those lands had been entrusted, the delicate frontier between the county and the kingdom of Uranetta. To him, it seemed like a harbinger of the Marquis Fadio's excessive ambition. Even so, something did not add up. A child prodigy, expelled from his home and sent to a remote territory. The most likely conclusion was simple: Van had no affinity with any of the 4 elemental magics. Van knew that, no matter how much he tried to hide it, the truth would eventually come out. Therefore, he calmly replied that she was correct. He truly had no affinity with the 4 elements. However, He assured her that the other suspicions were unfounded. He had only been sent away by his father's own decision. The woman did not believe it for a single moment. To her, it sounded like an outright lie. A remote village, barely exceeding 100 inhabitants, had raised solid walls in an extremely short time, rebuilt all its structures with modern designs, and organized its infrastructure as if it were a planned city. In her view, that would only be possible with the deployment of at least 5,000 subordinates, a clear attempt to turn the place into a military base. That was when Van suddenly burst out laughing, sincerely and without restraint. He explained that his father had only allowed him to bring Khamsin and a single travel cart. Not a single family member had even come to see him off. Surprised, the woman then questioned the presence of the butler, the knight, and the maid. Van answered simply, all of them believed in his future. They felt that something grand would be born there. To prove that he was not lying, Van decided to demonstrate it in practice. He asked Espada to create a magical barrier. The old man promptly obeyed, raising a powerful defense that left both women completely impressed, especially when they realized that he possessed affinity with all 4 elements. The girl then asked what Van's magical affinity actually was. He answered without hesitation. Production magic, regarded by everyone as the weakest and most useless. The revelation shocked her. That magic had always been a reason for exclusion and contempt. Van explained that as soon as his affinity was discovered, he was expelled from home. His father did not even know the true extent of his abilities. To the woman, that was an unforgivable waste. With the Marquis's influence, Van's powers could have expanded the family's domain in unimaginable ways. Even so, despite her indignation, she began to understand the situation better. She then revealed the true reason for her visit. She had been tasked with proceeding with the engagement between Van and Alt. The Count had sent his daughter to prevent any future hostility. Van responded honestly. He intended to continue reinforcing the walls and developing the village. But he did not wish to enter into conflict with anyone. If that was understood, a marriage would not be necessary. The woman confessed that she had always been against the engagement. Van was a child, lord of a remote and dangerous territory. Even if he were competent, there was a strong chance that Alt would lead an unhappy life isolated, without resources, threatened by bandits and monsters, and possibly destroyed along with the village. That was why she had traveled there determined to stop the marriage. However, everything changed after meeting him. If the engagement were with Van, she would support it wholeheartedly. His genius, vision for the future, and maturity were beyond this world. She even joked that, if he were older, she herself would have offered to become his fiancé. Van was genuinely happy with the praise. When both were asked for their opinion, he and Alt agreed that it was still far too early. They needed to get to know each other better. They decided to spend the night in the village. In just a few hours, Van built an inn, once again leaving them impressed. After dinner, the woman went to sleep, while Alt shyly thanked him for the day. She said she felt relieved, as she thought she would be forced into marriage. Shortly after, she ran off to rest. The final scene showed Van reflecting in silence. Even without possessing affinity with the 4 elements, he knew that his path was only beginning, and if Alt wished to remain in the village, he would not oppose it. The scene shifts to Van, who is sleeping peacefully in his bed, enjoying a rare moment of rest, when he is abruptly awakened by his maid. She calls him repeatedly, urging him to wake up immediately because an urgent situation has arisen. Still groggy and with heavy eyes, Van tries to understand what is happening as she explains that Dee and Espada have already rushed ahead to deal with the problem. Still half asleep, Van asks where exactly this is happening. The maid then reminds him that a few days earlier, Van had created a lake behind the village using his abilities. It is precisely at that location that something strange is occurring. As he leaves the house and walks in that direction, Van notices the unusual movement of the villagers and asks why the lake was named after him. The maid replies that it was a collective decision by the villagers, who wanted to honor his great achievements by naming the place so that his name would be remembered by future generations. She also mentions that some villagers even suggested changing the name of the village itself to Van, but he immediately asks them to abandon that idea. Van feels that such a decision could cause problems in the future, both politically and socially. and he prefers to avoid any kind of excessive idolization. When he finally arrives at the location, he asks what exactly is happening. Looking ahead, his eyes widen as he notices a mermaid emerging from the lake. Espada explains that the creature is known as an apkaru, a type of demi-human that is half human, half fish. According to the stories, this race lives in a beautiful river hidden deep within the forest and, for some unknown reason, ended up appearing in the lake newly created by Van. It is an extremely rare species, almost never seen by humans. Van asks if he can help in any way, but receives no response. He then tries to ask her name, but is once again ignored. Faced with the silence, Van asks for a piece of meat to be brought. When the meat arrives, he carefully approaches and asks her to come closer as well. His intention is to show friendship, believing that offering food is the best way to build trust. The creature cautiously approaches and asks if she may eat. Van replies that she can. She then asks what kind of meat it is, and he explains that it is armored lizard meat. Van also adds that if she wants to come back the next day, he can offer dried meat. The girl asks who defeated such a dangerous monster, and everyone points to Van, saying that it was him. After hearing this, she dives back into the lake and disappears without saying anything else. Van watches the water in silence and asks if she will appear again. But Espada explains that, since it is such a rare species, they will likely never see her again. However, contrary to all expectations, the next day several apkaros appear in the lake, leaving everyone completely astonished. Suddenly, the leader of the group approaches and asks to speak with Van. He thanks him for helping his daughter and comments that he heard Van was responsible for defeating the armored lizards. Van replies that he managed to defeat them, but makes a point of emphasizing that he did not do it alone. The leader then makes an unexpected decision and proposes that Van marry his daughter, named Lada Priora. Surprised, Van explains that she is still just a child and probably does not even understand the meaning of marriage. He asks if there is another reason for such a sudden proposal. The man explains that his clan has lived isolated from humans until now, but in recent years the armored lizards began inhabiting the river where they live, causing countless losses. For that reason, he is looking for a strong man capable of protecting his daughter and ensuring a safe place for everyone to live. Van responds that the girl does not need to marry now and that, in the future, she should choose for herself whom she wants to marry. Even so, he promises to protect them all, regardless of any marriage agreement. With that, the apkaros decide to settle in that location. Van then creates several houses over the lake, allowing everyone to live peacefully and safely. After that, everyone is extremely happy and deeply grateful to Van. Soon after, Espada asks them to help clean the village sewage. The water from the moat is periodically dumped into the treatment facilities, and leaving it as it is would be very unhygienic. The leader replies that they can leave that task to them, since they are experts in underwater work. They carry out the job with great ease. He asks whether this work is done every day, and Van confirms that it is. The man then offers to take care of it regularly as a form of gratitude for being welcomed. Van thanks him, saying that it will be a great help to the village. Before he realizes it, two girls appear behind Van. As he says goodbye to the leader, who calls him his son-in-law, both girls look visibly annoyed. Van tries to explain that it is not like that, but one of the girls firmly states that Van is her husband. The next day, Van decides to clear up the misunderstanding. The girl says she already understands the situation, explaining that they talked to her and that it was not true, apologizing for the mistake. Changing the subject, she comments on how impressed she is by the fact that Van created an entire lake and developed the village so easily. Van explains that none of it would have been possible without everyone's collective effort. As they talk, Lada appears and asks who the girl beside Van is. Shortly afterward, several children come running to greet him, but they end up rocking the boat too much, causing Alt to fall on top of Van. Lada feels a slight sense of jealousy at the sight, but decides to let it go. Suddenly, Lada's father appears, questioning why Van is surrounded by two women. Van hurriedly responds that it is nothing like that, and that he does not have any women. But the man does not believe him. He then proposes a game. If Van loses, he will be forced to marry his daughter. With no way to escape the situation, Van accepts the challenge. Van chooses the first game, which is volleyball, a sport completely unknown in that world. The competition begins, and everyone has a lot of fun. Van's team starts out being completely dominated, but little by little, they manage to recover and begin to dispute the match point by point. When only 1 point was left to win, they end up losing. However, there are still 2 games left. Since the dispute is best of 3, the man chooses the next challenge, swimming. D offers to participate, and the event is in pairs. He swims alongside another boy, who ends up falling behind, while D uses his unique swimming style and wins with enormous ease. The leader did not expect to lose precisely in the event in which he believed he had the greatest advantage. Finally, he asks Van to choose the last challenge. Van decides that it will be a shaved ice eating competition, in which the winner is whoever manages to eat the fastest. The contest is also in pairs, and Van himself participates. He starts far behind because he feels his brain freeze from the intense cold. Almost giving up, he is encouraged by Alt, regains his strength, and begins to eat at an impressive speed. In the end, his team wins the competition. Even with the defeat, the man is satisfied with Van's performance and comes to believe even more strongly that he is the ideal person for his daughter. After he leaves, Van starts to wonder why he tried so hard to win that duel. Shortly afterward, he feels a strong stomachache. While the girl watches everything, impressed by how much everyone around him cares about him, she begins to question, in silence, how she could become someone truly suitable for Van. This thought starts to occupy her mind frequently, especially when she observes how admired he is by everyone around him. Since she was little, her life was never marked by affection. Her father was always too busy with duties and responsibilities to give her any kind of attention. Her mother, in turn, left her in the care of a nanny very early on, and never showed genuine interest in her existence. The reason for all of this was simple and painful. She was weak. She was afraid of many things, stumbled in her studies, took a long time to learn, and did not possess talents that caught anyone's attention. She was constantly compared to other more capable children, and, in those comparisons, she always came out losing. The only thing in which she truly stood out was puppet magic. When she controlled one of them, she felt that her body became lighter, freer, moving with a precision and naturalness that she herself could not achieve. She believed, with all her heart, that this magic could be the path to winning her mother's love. However, what she received in return was only a cold and painful slap. They told her that puppet magic was seen as something evil among the nobility, something unworthy, repulsive. It was at that moment that she understood, in a cruel way, that she was not just ignored, but rejected. From that day on, no one spoke to her sincerely anymore. Her presence began to be ignored, as if she did not exist. Thus, she ended up becoming invisible in the eyes of others, living like that until she turned 10 years old. It was then that, suddenly, her father appeared with a decision already made. She was to marry Van. Even without fully understanding what that meant, she accepted it. Deep down, she had always thought Van was kind, responsible, and incredibly talented. When she watched him, she felt something different, a mixture of admiration and respect. Because of that, she decided that she would train hard. She wanted to become strong, someone who could walk by his side without feeling shame or inferiority. The next day, Van gathers everyone and asks them to put maximum effort into their work. He promises that, if everyone works hard, the following day they would have time off and hold a big barbecue to celebrate. The simple promise is enough to lift everyone's spirits. At that moment, the girl appears and observes the scene from a distance, realizing that the way Van motivates people is truly special. He does not use fear or excessive authority, but simple and sincere words that make everyone want to give their best. Van explains that he always needs to encourage his people and that he will continue doing so whenever he has the opportunity. He believes that a leader should walk alongside others, not above them. Suddenly, Alt appears at the place and asks if she can accompany Van during his day of work. The boy accepts without hesitation, as if it were something natural. Upon hearing the answer, Alt becomes visibly happy and, in that very moment, decides that she will do her utmost to become stronger, determined not to be a burden to him. The scene then shifts abruptly. A group of adventurers appears running desperately through the forest. with expressions of pure terror on their faces, fleeing from something that cannot be seen, and thus another episode comes to an end. The scene shifts to the protagonist, who shows great satisfaction upon realizing that he has managed to expand the city walls even further. He carefully observes each newly constructed section, running his eyes over the reinforced structures and the towers that now rise with greater prominence. A slight smile appears on his face as he acknowledges how much Panamera has evolved since its early days. The progress is visible, and he feels proud for having directly contributed to that advancement. Everyone around is also impressed by the expansion. The residents speak among themselves, amazed at the speed of the changes. The girl, in particular, cannot hide how surprised she is, since he keeps finding new ways to astonish her. Van, in turn, carefully observes the walls of Panamera and comments that they should never stop growing. To him, a strong city must always think about the future. He explains that, with the increase in resilient and hardworking residents, he decided to build several homes to accommodate merchants and adventurers who chose to move there. The city is becoming a strategic point, attracting more and more people interested in opportunities. Panamera listens to everything with admiration, for her greatest dream is, one day, to build a true empire. Looking further ahead, she frowns when she notices an enormous structure positioned right in front and asks what it is. Van replies that it is a ballista. He decided to improve the simple model he had previously created, making it more efficient and durable. The girl asks if he built it himself. Van confirms naturally and explains that he modified the mechanism to launch 2 projectiles simultaneously, considerably increasing its attack power. When they decide to test it, the shot is so powerful that it cuts through the air with a deafening roar and ends up destroying part of a nearby mountain. Dust rises, and the impact leaves everyone silent for a few moments. The boy realizes that the result turned out even better than he expected. Panamera, visibly impressed, states that she would like to buy that ballista for whatever price he sets. Van, however, replies that it is not for sale. Not giving up, Panamera asks him to grant her one, reminding him that he still owes her a favor. The boy agrees, but warns that in the future he will ask for that favor back. She accepts without hesitation, confident that she will be able to handle any request. Van then asks how she intends to transport something so heavy to the city. After reflecting for a few seconds, she decides to arrange a reinforced carriage suitable to bear the weight of the weapon. They also comment that, since the bolts are made of iron, it might be possible to develop a method to produce them in greater quantity, ensuring a constant supply of ammunition. One of the knights suggests that Panamera should also take a sword forged by Van. She refuses, stating that she already possesses 2 excellent blades, to demonstrate the superiority of his creation. The boy cuts one of her swords with extreme ease, as if it were a simple dry branch. Surprised, she asks what that blade is made of. Van calmly answers that it is just ordinary iron. The reply leaves her even more impressed. She then questions whether the ballista is also made of the same material. He confirms and adds that its projectiles are capable of piercing through 2 or even 3 armored lizards at once. Panamera asks for a few extra bolts in addition to the ballista, anticipating the need to reinforce her defenses. Van agrees without objections. She thanks Comson for having mediated the acquisition of the powerful bolts created by him. However, the moment of tranquility is interrupted when a group of adventurers appears running toward the city, shouting that they were unable to hide. Right behind them, a dragon appears in the sky, advancing at a frightening speed. Van immediately declares that he will try to buy time so that they can eliminate the beast. Panamera decides to help him in order to repay the favor she received, asking only that they take all safely to the city. Van apologizes for placing her in such a dangerous situation. He acknowledges that the forest dragon is a formidable enemy, far above the threats they have faced so far. Even so, they now have reinforced ballistas and Panamera's strength on their side. They may not be able to defeat it easily, but they do not intend to lose either. Van orders his maid to accompany the girl and call Dee and the other reinforcements. As the dragon approaches, its presence instills fear in everyone. The sound of its wings cutting through the air echoes over the city. One of the adventurers stumbles and falls, but another throws a sword to distract the creature, creating a small opening. Panamera states with conviction that only she can defeat it. Climbing onto the wall with agility, she delivers a powerful strike that nearly eliminates the dragon in the first impact. Even severely wounded, it continues to rise. Van realizes that after defeating the armored lizards, they may have become overly confident. Now they face something on a completely different level. He orders the ballistas to keep firing. The shots cross the sky, but the dragon skillfully dodges, although its wings end up partially damaged. The adventurers manage to enter the village while Panamera decides to buy time so that everyone can take shelter. Her first direct strike misses, but the second hits the creature with terrifying force. Descending from the wall, she prepares to face it directly on the ground. Even wounded and bleeding, the dragon continues attacking as if ignoring the pain. Espada unexpectedly appears on the battlefield. Van asks him to retreat so they can flee together, but he refuses to abandon the fight. He decides to use his stone strike to delay the creature. After executing the attack, he can no longer run. Yet one of Van's allies remains by his side. While most retreat, Panamera advances once more and reaffirms that she can defeat the beast. Van asks if she can repay the favor at that exact moment. He quickly explains the plan. When the dragon reaches the wall, she must use the previous magic to paralyze its movements, creating a perfect opening for a barrage of shots from the ballistas. D and his companions arrive to help, but they are thrown back by the creature's overwhelming power. Espada once again uses his ability to gain a few precious seconds, allowing the others to retreat safely. Van then asks Panamera to execute her strike immediately. At the right moment, she paralyzes the dragon with her magic. Van shouts the order, and the ballistas fire almost simultaneously. By a very narrow margin, they manage to bring down the forest dragon. D approaches to finish the fight, nearly being struck by one last desperate attack. But he manages to retreat and counterattack with precision. After a few more intense moments, they finally defeat the creature. The dragon's enormous body falls to the ground, raising dust and marking the end of the battle. Panamera approaches Van and congratulates him for having led everyone against such a powerful enemy. He, however, hesitates to accept the credit. She comments that if it had been an ordinary village, it would have been completely destroyed. People like Espada and D are rare, especially a hero capable of severing a dragon's head with a single blow. Moreover, the ballistas proved to possess extraordinary power, something she had never imagined capable of piercing dragon scales. Van, however, knows that there is still much to improve. He wants the ballistas to be able to fire at least 10 consecutive times without failure. Panamera says that, at that moment, that does not matter. What truly matters is that they defeated a dragon. They must immediately announce the victory, and D needs to be recognized as a true dragon slayer. At the guild, Van declares that, with the defeat of the forest dragon, also known as the Lord of the Forest, they will reward those who contributed the most to the victory. Panamera emphasizes that, even being a small village, they managed to win without suffering a single death, something extremely rare when facing a threat of that magnitude. Thus, the city celebrates not only survival, but the beginning of a new era for Panamera. Next, the title is granted to Espada. His magic was essential in containing the monster during the most critical moments of the battle. By keeping the creature restrained and limiting its movements, he created the necessary openings for the others to act. Without his precise intervention, the plan might never have worked. His recognition comes not only for his strength, but for the strategy and control he demonstrated under extreme pressure. Finally, Van's name is announced. Despite being only 8 years old, he demonstrated a level of knowledge, initiative, and quick reasoning that does not match his age. Not only did he organize the defenses efficiently, but he also used a magical technique never seen before, rapidly reinforcing the guild's structures and the walls. His ability to analyze the situation and lead the subjugation campaign was decisive. For that reason, he is recognized as the Lord of the Two Lands, a title that carries political and symbolic weight. While the celebrations continue, the narrative turns to Panamera's thoughts. She, who rose from knight to nobility through her own merit, has already known people from countless social positions, ambitious soldiers, proud nobles, brilliant strategists, and even influential figures of the royal court. Even so, she has never encountered someone like Van. There is something about him that defies expectations, an unusual combination of genius, boldness, and vision for the future. It is then revealed that Panamera was born in the royal capital, into a traditional family of knights. Since childhood, she was raised under strict discipline, learning values such as honor, duty, and loyalty. When her magical aptitude was discovered, her family understood that her potential needed to be refined in the best possible way. Thus, she was sent to the territory of a count renowned for offering ideal conditions for the development of exceptional talents. The training she received was harsher than most could endure. The regimen was rigorous, demanding physical endurance, precise magical control, and tactical mastery. Many who began the same path gave up before completing it. Panamera, however, persevered. She studied intensely, sacrificed nights of sleep, and devoted every moment to the improvement of her abilities. She accepted no mediocrity, not even from herself. Over the years, her efforts began to bear fruit. She became a platoon leader and later commander of the Count's family knights. She participated in several battles, faced real threats, and accumulated significant military successes. Her firm leadership and accurate decisions caught the attention of Her Majesty herself, who began to observe her with growing admiration. 6 years later, she received with extraordinary speed the title of Viscountess, a rare achievement for someone so young and even more unusual for someone who had not inherited the position by direct lineage, but had earned it through merit. Her name began to circulate with respect among nobles and military officials alike. One day, she was summoned by Count Ferdinand. He had delicate political plans. He intended to marry his youngest daughter to the lord of a distant land, strengthening strategic alliances. Panamera was given the mission of overseeing the preparations and ensuring the security of the journey and the negotiations. It was a task of trust, one that required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. Upon arriving in the city where the agreement would be finalized, something unexpected happened. The young woman destined for the marriage ended up becoming interested in Van. There was something different about him, a firm posture, an uncommon intelligence, and a way of seeing the world that stood apart from everything she had ever known. His presence seemed to carry a breath of novelty, a wind of change capable of altering destinies. It was as if he represented the beginning of a new era. Panamera observed the situation carefully, accustomed to evaluating political scenarios and weighing consequences. She quickly realized that Van was not merely a talented boy, he was a point of convergence for something greater. The Marquis's clan, theoretically responsible for that region, had not offered any concrete assistance to the village. In contrast, Van had strengthened the walls, organized defenses, and led his people to victory against a dragon. In light of this, Panamera made a strategic decision. She would establish an alliance with him. If the village were under her official protection, Count Ferdinand's knights would pose no threat. Furthermore, the alliance could create an axis of military and commercial cooperation advantageous to both sides. She explained her proposal clearly. By sealing the alliance, the city would not need to fear external offensives connected to the Count. There would be formal support, recognition, and political stability. Van listened attentively, analyzing every word. He quickly understood the strategic advantages. Reducing the number of enemies and increasing the number of allies had always been a basic principle of survival and growth. If, in addition, the alliance brought economic benefits such as safer trade routes and the exchange of resources, the city would experience even more accelerated development. Panamera added that, if he accepted, Van's name would be remembered by many. That proposal represented a rare opportunity, something that could redefine the future of his land. After a brief moment of reflection, Van made his decision. He would accept that unique chance, not merely out of ambition, but because he understood that it was a necessary step to consolidate everything he had built up until then. Thus, a new alliance is formed, marking the beginning of an even more promising phase for the city, and bringing another episode of this story to a close. The following day, Van is extremely satisfied for having defeated the forest dragon without anyone getting hurt. Spardo comments that the walls he built were essential, because without them the outcome could have been very different. Now that the defense is secured, Spardo suggests that Van begin focusing on planning the city. Bang reminds them that he had said before that the objective should be to build a city capable of housing 10,000 people. Spardo explains that, For that to happen, and for the place to become attractive, it will be necessary to bring in new residents. Van understands the reasoning, but before he can respond, Till enters the office announcing that Bell and Rango have returned accompanied by representatives from the Merry Chamber of Commerce. They have come to negotiate the materials from the forest dragon. The group gathers to inspect the dragon's parts. Van grows curious about how much they will receive. Rango explains that it is a great forest dragon, and that its scales, claws, fangs, and eyes are in excellent condition. Because of that, he believes they can obtain at least 100 platinum coins. Van makes a quick calculation. 1 platinum coin is equivalent to about 100 million yen. That means 100 coins would represent 10 billion yen, something around $65 million. He is stunned, feeling as if he had just won the lottery. The merchants confirm that the dragon is authentic and ask that the materials be entrusted to the Merry Chamber of Commerce. They guarantee that they are the most respected in the field and that, with the support of the royal family, they can offer the best possible price. Excited, they ask how much they would receive. However, the traders say that, considering the current market, they can offer around 60 platinum coins. The difference surprises the group. Van decides to consult Bell and Rango before responding, but the merchants try to stop him, saying that the brothers are still young and inexperienced. Van ignores the pressure and informs the two about the offer. Bell considers the amount absurd, since the materials are of extremely high quality. The merchants insist that they are also part of the chamber and that they must follow the established values. Bell counters, stating that a fair evaluation must be made, regardless of the situation. The traders then argue that no other merchant will visit that remote village for at least a year. Therefore, even offering 60 coins, Van would have no alternative. He remains silent, listening even to the whispers. He knows that, although 60 coins still represent a fortune, large companies rarely act with mercy. Bell and Rango make it clear that their goal is to negotiate fairly, because they believe that will bring greater profits in the future. The merchants dislike the stance and warn that, if the president learns about the resistance, the brothers may be expelled from the Merry Chamber of Commerce. In response, Van suggests something unexpected, that they found their own trading company. The idea surprises everyone. Rango comments that it sounds too simple, but Bell explains that there are 3 requirements: pay the registration fee at the Merchants Guild, own a store of their own, and obtain formal support from a titled noble. The first 2 conditions seem feasible, but the third is complicated. The only nearby noble is Panamera. They decide to speak with her and explain the situation. To their surprise, Panamera agrees to help with ease. Van questions whether this would not create problems, since the Merry Chamber of Commerce has the support of the royal family. Panamera asks him to reflect. As a newly promoted noble, supporting a small company would not harm her image. On the contrary, it could generate positive comments and strengthen her position. In addition, she does not possess vast territories, so she needs to build influence in other ways. The partnership would benefit both sides. Van then suggests that he could publicly declare that he defeated the dragon, which would draw attention and make interference from his family more difficult. Panamera points out that his reasoning has flaws. Dragons are rarely killed. If he claimed that, they would investigate thoroughly, and his family would find out anyway. Van begins to worry about the possibility of being summoned back home. Panamera then reveals an alternative: to obtain his own title. She explains the noble hierarchy: knight, baron, viscount, count, marquis, and duke. She herself was promoted from knight. As the son of a marquis, Van would likely receive the title of baron at first. To do that, he would need to found a new noble house, becoming independent from his family. She adds that, technically, he only immobilized the dragon. Declaring that he killed it would attract too much attention, but it could turn him into the famous 8-year-old boy who defeated a dragon. That feat could serve as a foundation to earn his own title and secure his autonomy. After the entire explanation, Panamera admits that she understands this type of situation very well. When she earned her own title, several enemies appeared and many people tried to take advantage of her. Even so, she resolved everything using her elemental magic. Without showing mercy, she states that if an opponent appears, one must not hesitate to confront them. According to her, when a few examples are made, the others think twice before opposing. She begins to laugh after saying that, while Van remains thoughtful, feeling that he has just received somewhat frightening advice about how to survive in the world of nobility. Then he comments that, if he declares that everything was her idea, it could harm Panamera's own chances of further promotion. She looks at him with an intimidating expression and says that he, at only 8 years old, does not need to worry about that kind of thing. Van quickly backtracks and states that now he is actually worried about his own safety. Panamera laughs again and jokes that he does not need to worry, at least not for the next 5 years. She finishes by saying that, if he continues growing and strengthening himself, he will be able to officially claim the feat of having defeated the dragon. Even somewhat apprehensive, Van decides to set that aside and informs the brothers that Panamera has agreed to support them. This means they can now open their own trading company. Belle and Rango are extremely happy, and, after a small celebration, ask to officially purchase the dragon's materials. Van accepts without difficulty. To his surprise, the brothers offer 130 platinum coins, saying they want to reward him for everything he has done for them. The deal is closed, and they decide to go to the royal capital to sell the materials. However, they soon realize that the carriage has disappeared. The merchants from the Merry Chamber of Commerce took it, clearly trying to force them to accept the previous conditions. Panamera explains that they expect that, without transportation, the brothers will eventually give in. Van, without being shaken, says that he will then build a new carriage. Panamera suggests using her war horses to pull it, explaining that they are extremely resilient and fast. In a short time, they depart from the village with a new carriage, leaving the chamber merchants behind. Upon arriving at the capital of the Kingdom of Escuderia, Panamera goes to the audience hall and recommends to King Dino Sora Belrenet that he grant a title to Van Nefertio, an 8-year-old boy, son of Marquis Ferdius and lord of a remote village. She reports that Van organized the village's defense against bandits, rebuilt the place with production magic, erected walls and a moat, and later immobilized a forest dragon, allowing its defeat without casualties. As proof, she presents one of the creature's fangs. Impressed, the king decides to meet him and publicly announces that Van will receive the title of Baron. Meanwhile, in the village, Van continues promoting improvements, rebuilding areas, upgrading uniforms, and erecting the Oligo and Yuva towers as symbols of prosperity and defense. During a picnic at the top of one of the towers, the idea arises to officially transform the village into a city. But Van prevents the jokingly suggested name from becoming official. Later, T prepares a cake with ingredients obtained thanks to the new local shop, reinforcing the sense of progress. Soon, a group of people from the county of Ferdinando arrives seeking shelter, fleeing high taxes and war. Even knowing that he should not interfere in another territory, Van welcomes them and promises to send an escort to bring the remaining residents, around 300 in total. Their arrival strengthens the economy, especially with the introduction of dairy cows. Received with a banquet, the newcomers find work and regain hope. With population growth and new commercial projects, the village moves closer to the dream of becoming a great city, and Van reaffirms his commitment to that prosperous future. The village becomes increasingly busy. The scene begins at the end of the day, when the sky is already tinted with orange hues and exhaustion weighs on everyone's shoulders. The work has finally ended, and many were already thinking about resting, eating something warm, and simply lying down. However, someone decides that it is still time to study. Van immediately complains, crossing his arms and saying that after everything they have done since early morning, that is already too much. The response comes dry and direct, almost automatic. No one dies from studying. But serious news interrupts the moment. During a hunt nearby, the entrance to a dungeon was discovered. The atmosphere changes immediately. Discovering a dungeon is not something simple. It means notifying the royal capital without delay. And notifying the capital means adventurers arriving in large numbers, attracted by the promise of rewards, treasures, and fame. It also means that Van's father might end up discovering the plans that have been kept secret until now. Even so, there is no way to ignore what happened. Pretending that nothing occurred would only make everything worse later. The decision is made without hesitation. Someone needs to go to the capital to deliver the official report and formalize the discovery. Kusara takes responsibility without drama. She leaves alone the following morning. Carrying the necessary documents, she delivers the notice to the proper authorities, receives a small reward in mithril for the report, and immediately begins the return journey. Without lingering in the capital longer than necessary, the scene cuts to the road. On the way back, along a more isolated stretch, Kusara finds a woman being attacked by a group of men. The aggressors are no match for her. The fight ends quickly, almost without effort. The stranger, still out of breath, introduces herself as Flameria. She explains that she lost her father in the war, had her house taken by opportunists, and was heading to the capital to try to find work as a maid, with few alternatives available. Kusara does not stall or make vague promises. She makes a direct and practical proposal. Instead of risking herself alone in the capital, Flameria can go to the village where she lives. With the newly discovered dungeon, there are clear plans for expansion. More adventurers mean more commerce, more services, more work, and there it would be easier to protect her from abuse. Flameria accepts. Meanwhile, in the village, the plans move forward at an accelerated pace. The dungeon will inevitably attract people from all places, and not only adventurers. Merchants, blacksmiths, innkeepers, curious onlookers. Then the idea that changes everything emerges, to build a small city around the village, a center specifically aimed at adventurers. To organize this new structure, it will be necessary to appoint a magistrate in charge and even create a new order of knights separate from the main village, focused on the security of the new nucleus. The proposal grows quickly, taking concrete shape. New knights are recruited, an administrative structure begins to be designed, and walls start to be erected around the planned area. Van assumes coordination of the construction with a seriousness surprising for his age. Materials arrive non-stop. Carts move in and out the entire day. The goal is bold: to raise the foundation of the new city in only 1 month. But news of the dungeon spreads faster than any planning. People interested in easy money begin to appear even before the construction is finished. Some are legitimate adventurers, experienced and organized. Others are clearly opportunists, with calculating looks and doubtful promises. Kusara returns and officially introduces Flameria. Van receives both without excessive formalities. It does not take long for troublemakers to appear near the dungeon area. Suspicious men linger around the place, pretending concern while analyzing opportunities for profit or exploitation. Some try to pose as protectors, warning about dangers and monsters, but their intentions do not seem noble at all. Flameria observes everything carefully. Despite the intimidating appearance of certain residents and knights, she realizes that many are simply trying to maintain order and prevent the situation from getting out of control. When they question how they managed to raise such large walls in such a short time, Van responds in the simplest way possible. He demonstrates. In front of everyone, he uses magic to raise a temporary structure, lifting stone upon stone with impressive precision. The reaction is immediate. Absolute surprise spreads among the newcomers. Respect increases. But not everyone is satisfied with that. An arrogant noble appears, belittling Van because of his age and position, insinuating that he should not be leading anything on that scale. The atmosphere heats up quickly. A commander of knights linked to that noble threatens to take formal measures. After the conflict with the noble, the routine changes in a curious way. The delinquents with mohawk haircuts who once caused problems now greet D whenever they see him, almost like admirers. He makes it clear that any misstep will not be forgiven, maintaining discipline. Meanwhile, Van, even though he is still a child lord, seems to enjoy commanding everything with confidence. Some comment that he was expelled from his own house and that the world is cruel even to young nobles. Van replies with firm pride that he is still a lord, whether they like it or not. The village becomes increasingly busy. Groups return from the dungeon bringing reports about monsters, traps, and possible rewards. When they discuss the dungeon in detail, they explain that access is dangerous. It is located near a deep cliff, 2 or 3 hours away from the village. The surrounding terrain is unstable, with loose stones and narrow trails, far from ideal for unprepared or reckless adventurers. Van listens to everything carefully, without interrupting, evaluating every detail. and makes a simple and practical decision. If the problem is infrastructure, then they will build one. The scene cuts to the following day. The group sets out toward the dungeon's entrance. When they arrive near an improvised log that serves as a passage over the cliff, he immediately orders everyone to stop. He calmly explains that a single minimal mistake would be enough for someone to die there. Even someone agile could fall if the wood gave way or if the wind blew stronger. It is not enough to simply be careful or rely on luck. The correct solution is to eliminate the risk once and for all. So he decides, without hesitation, they will build a real bridge. First, he installs a reinforced gate, tall and thick, solid enough to prevent any monster from leaving without control. The structure is not merely symbolic. It is practical, resistant, and designed to withstand real impacts. Then, without pause, he raises an entire building beside the entrance, intended to serve as support for adventurers who plan to explore the location frequently. The structure impresses even the most experienced. The first floor is a wide rest area, with enough space for several groups at the same time. Reinforced benches, large tables, and an environment designed so that adventurers can recover their strength after incursions, treat light injuries, and reorganize their equipment. The second floor houses a spacious dining hall, prepared to receive large groups without disorder. The arrangement of the tables avoids confusion, and the kitchen was planned to function even on days of intense movement, when the dungeon is attracting explorers from every direction. The third floor contains comfortable rooms, organized in a practical way, but with attention to details. The windows offer a view of the surrounding landscape, and there is even a small terrace where it is possible to breathe fresh air away from the tension of the dungeon entrance. As if that were not enough, Van also adds a reservoir on the roof to collect rainwater. He clearly explains that the water can be used for cleaning, washing equipment, and other general tasks, but it is not drinkable without proper treatment. Even after making that clear, he notices from the exchanged glances that not everyone completely understood the difference. He sighs discreetly, already foreseeing reinforced warnings in the future. With everything practically ready and functional, he hands over the administration of the base to Orto, entrusting him with organizing the flow of adventurers and resources. He reinforces firmly, leaving no room for discussion, that safety comes before any reckless adventurer's bravado. No one enters or leaves without registration, and no one ignores protocols just because they believe they are strong enough. The sun begins to set, tinting the sky with gold and red. Van looks toward the horizon and decides that it is time to return to the village. Despite leading gigantic constructions and making strategic decisions, he is still a child and has a curfew. He jokes, trying to lighten the mood, saying that if he stays there past the allowed time, he might end up destroying the base himself just to avoid getting scolded. Some laugh, but they know he is half serious about the warning he would receive. It is at that moment that Art notices something different on the ground. Near the newly erected area, a subtle metallic shine draws attention among the stones and the soil turned over by the construction. Upon closer examination, they confirm it is mithril ore, the real thing. Van checks personally, crouching down to analyze the material carefully. The finding is enormous. For a few moments, excitement takes over the group. Such a rare resource not only increases the value of the dungeon, but completely changes the strategic value of the entire region. Upon arriving at the village, Van notices that Espada has an unfriendly expression on his face. He asks the boy to come inside as soon as possible so they can talk. Van begins asking all of his friends for help, but no one wants to face Espada's fury. Van clings to Ortho since he is an adventurer and might be able to help him. He tries to help the boy, but Espada tells him to stay quiet and grabs Van by the shoulder, taking him home. And that is how another episode ends. I hope all of you liked it, and if you did, leave your like for more content like this. I will see you next week, and goodbye. When going out for a walk with his friend, the two of them stroll calmly through the streets of the city, observing every detail around them with renewed attention. The newly erected buildings stand out against the clear sky. The organized stalls display varied goods, and the constant movement of dedicated workers draws the attention of those who pass by. Then, curious and a little anxious, he asks what she is thinking of the village, since it had been quite a long time since she had arrived, and he truly wanted to know her honest opinion. The girl's answer comes in a completely unexpected way, breaking the light rhythm of the conversation. With her face slightly flushed and her hands joined in front of her body, she says that she would like to marry him. The world seems to stop for a moment, as if even the wind had decided to fall silent to hear that confession. The two of them turn completely red, not knowing where to look or what to say next. Van's heart races, and his thoughts become tangled in a chaotic manner. Unable to organize his own ideas, he asks, somewhat clumsily and with his voice faltering, whether it would not be better to pretend that sentence had never been spoken. She agrees immediately, trying to ease the awkward atmosphere that had settled between them. Even so, after the uncomfortable silence that follows, she notices that he seems even happier than before, as if that confession had lit something special inside him, something he still did not know how to explain. Some time later, the merchants return to the city bringing news. They arrive excited, full of stories gathered during the journey, proudly saying that they finally managed to open the company as they had planned from the beginning. As previously agreed, they hand Van 130 coins as part of the established deal. He receives the payment calmly, thanking them for their effort, but soon asks when Panamera intends to return to the village, showing genuine concern. The merchants explain that she needed to resolve an urgent matter with the Count, and that, because of this, she should take a little longer than expected to come back. Van also asks whether she intends to live there permanently in the future. The answer is negative. She decided to remain in the neighboring kingdom to consolidate her own projects. Even so, Van comments that, the way things are progressing, it would not be surprising if, before long, she ended up becoming queen. Such is her determination. Before departing again, the men hand him a modern ballista, extremely advanced by the standards of the capital and difficult to find even among the best equipped military forces. The mechanism impresses with its complexity and precision, being capable of firing up to 10 arrows in sequence with speed and efficiency, something rare even in royal fortresses. Curiously, Van shows himself even more excited about the weapon than about the platinum coins he received, examining every detail with a gleam in his eyes. Excited like a child facing a new challenge, he tries to reproduce the mechanism on his own. He analyzes every gear, every fitting, every small structural detail, trying to understand the exact functioning of the structure and memorize its internal logic. However, despite his skill and intelligence, he ends up failing on the first attempt, which makes him sigh for a brief moment. The girl watches in surprise, realizing that even Van can make mistakes like any other person. He simply laughs, without any frustration or shame, and explains that failing is part of life and learning. According to him, no one truly evolves without trying several times and learning from their own mistakes. Driven by the curiosity that always accompanies him, Van asks what her magical aptitude is. The question makes the girl visibly shaken, as if it touched an old wound she tried to hide. The maid quickly intervenes, saying that if she does not want to answer, she does not need to feel obligated to speak about something so personal. Even so, the young woman gathers courage, takes a deep breath, and reveals that her magic is puppet magic. They know that this type of ability is usually viewed with suspicion by the nobility and by society in general, often considered useless or even dangerous by those who do not understand its true potential. Van, contrary to what she expected, asks to see the magic in action, since few people possess that rare gift. To encourage her and show that there is no reason for shame, he uses his own power and creates a small puppet before her, shaping it naturally. The attitude demonstrates confidence and acceptance. Encouraged by that sincere gesture, the girl begins a small dance with the dolls she controls. The maid suggests that they show the performance to the villagers, for they would certainly be impressed and enchanted by the spectacle. However, the girl hesitates, explaining that this magic is often seen as a curse and may cause fear or rejection. Van understands that feeling perfectly, for he carries similar memories. He shares that his own magic was also considered cursed by many, including his father, who once called him a failure and doubted his worth. Even so, it was precisely that power that allowed him to protect the village, strengthen his allies, and make so many people happy along the way. He states, with firm conviction and a determined gaze, that the villagers will like her ability and recognize her talent. Upon hearing those sincere words, the girl feels something different growing inside her, a timid hope that begins to replace years of insecurity. For she had spent her entire life believing she had no value, and, for the first time, she begins to doubt that belief. At nightfall, everyone gathers in front of an improvised stage, curious to discover what Van is planning. Some whisper among themselves, remembering that puppet magic had once been used by criminals in the past and could get out of control. The comments make the girl nervous, but Van remains by her side the entire time, offering silent support. With his encouragement, she finds courage and begins the dance. The puppets move with grace, telling a small story without words. Little by little, the audience's fear turns into admiration. When the performance ends, applause echoes through the square. Van steps onto the stage, publicly praises her talent, and, moved with emotion, the girl embraces him in front of everyone. The next day, the tranquility of the village is interrupted by the news that a carriage from the royal family is approaching. Van feels a slight tightness in his chest. It is not common to receive visits of that level. When he least expects it, Panamera appears at the place. She watches the girl using her magic with confidence and shows surprise, remembering how before she could barely use it. The young woman quickly asks Van to bow his head, for the king is present. The king, however, orders him to rise. In a firm voice, he announces that, from that moment on, Van becomes a baron, officially joining the nobility of the kingdom. He asks him to work hard for the good of the country and for the strengthening of the region. He also shows interest in knowing more about the constructed dungeon, the defeat of the dragon, and the guild records, making it clear that lies will not be tolerated. Van decides to explain everything honestly, but asks that they not consider his story an invention. He begins by showing every part of the village, detailing how it was built. When presenting the ballista, he gives an impressive demonstration and fires 2 projectiles simultaneously, leaving those present amazed. He emphasizes that it is not necessary to rely only on elite mages to operate it, making defense more accessible. The king also observes the star-shaped walls. The architecture allows attacks from various angles and strategic adaptations. Panamera comments that the defense is impressive, although it could face difficulties against aerial enemies. Van then reveals that he has already made adjustments thinking exactly about that type of threat. When questioned whether it was he himself who built the walls and the ballistas, Van confirms naturally. The king demands absolute sincerity, while Panamera asks them to trust him. The prime minister questions the houses of the village, since they would take years to be erected under normal circumstances. Van states that he was also responsible for them. Walking through the village, the king realizes how much Van is loved by the residents. The way he speaks with everyone demonstrates closeness, respect, and mutual trust. Even still incredulous at such great capability, they agree to watch another demonstration. Outside, they find a group of individuals with an intimidating appearance. The prime minister asks who they are. Van explains that they are adventurers who became his allies after the construction of the dungeon. Next, he introduces Lauda's clan, which lives in harmony with society. The leader greets the king with respect and offers a rare gift made from minerals of the gods. Everyone knows that a sword of that material can be worth up to 100 coins. To prove his words, Van forges a sword before them. The king asks whether he is capable of producing weapons regularly. The boy tries to change the subject, but the king insists, willing to pay any amount for that ability. Van makes only one request. He wants the village to be officially his, forever, regardless of what happens in the future. The king does not understand why he does not wish to go to the capital and receive special privileges. Van replies that he prefers to remain there, protecting those people. If he abandons them, he fears what may happen to them. The king would like to have someone like Van by his side in the capital, but he recognizes his determination. He decides to grant him official responsibility over the land. Even so, he asks whether he would be willing to cooperate with the kingdom whenever necessary. Van accepts without hesitation. From that moment on, the king begins to treat him not as a talented child, but as a responsible man. Before departing, the king shows interest in visiting the dungeon. Van explains that it is far away and that, if they go now, they will arrive only at nightfall. At that instant, however, urgent news arises that a dragon has been sighted in the surroundings. Without hesitation, Van orders everyone to take positions on the walls and immediately summon the adventurers. And thus another episode comes to an end. As they raise their eyes toward the sky, everyone is surprised to realize that that monstrous creature is being guided by a mage. The king then asks the prime minister what the explanation for that could be. The prime minister replies that wyverns normally do not act alone, since they usually move in flocks. For that reason, it is very unlikely that only one of them would decide to attack a village on its own. As for the mage, he believes that there might be some other threat hidden nearby. The king then questions whether that could be the work of the kingdom of Reincarnates. The prime minister replies that this possibility is quite high. The king then turns to the boy and explains that their true enemy is not only the wyvern. There is a strong chance that a small group of experienced knights is involved in this. For that reason, he asks the boy to be very careful. Van observes that, at that distance, the arrows fired by the ballista would not be able to reach the target. Realizing that there is no other solution, he thinks that it may be necessary to test a prototype that has not yet been used. The scene then changes to a group of people walking through a forest. They comment that the wyvern has already begun scouting the skies above the village of Seat. One man shows great satisfaction while commenting that he himself, Unimog Reincarnates, the 8th prince of the kingdom of Reincarnates, is leading the invasion of a village so far away. One of the guards explains that, since this is a very important mission, the king decided to entrust this task to him. It is explained that the kingdom of Reincarnates maintains an old rivalry with the neighboring kingdom of Scuderia. However, for them, the moment has finally arrived to settle old scores with Scuderia. The person responsible for leading this initial attack is precisely His Highness, Prince Unimog. The prince states that, as long as it depends on him, conquering a remote village like that one will not be any problem. As they observe the road more carefully, they realize that they are about to reach their destination. When they finally catch sight of the place, everyone is impressed to notice that there is a fully structured base there. Some begin to wonder how it was possible to build something like that in such an isolated place. The prince orders everyone to remain silent and comments that building a fortified city like that is not a simple task. He believes that perhaps they only built the front part to create that impression. Then he decides that the best option is to continue advancing and seize the enemy territory. However, one of the people asks him to remain calm for a moment. The prince immediately asks whether anyone there intends to oppose his orders. Soon after, he commands everyone to do exactly what he determined. When they begin the attack, they are shocked to realize that they cannot break through the wall. The prince refuses to believe what he is seeing. At that moment, Van appears at the location and introduces himself as the master of that guild. He asks what reason led those men to attack a village like that. One of the men questions how he managed to discover that they belonged to the kingdom of Reincarnates. Van replies that he only said that as a test, and they themselves ended up confirming it without realizing it. The prince becomes frightened, because a village of that size should not possess a wall like that. He wants to know what kind of method was used to build a fortified city there. Van replies that he and the villagers themselves worked together to build that wall. The prince orders him to stop mocking them, saying that he does not intend to go easy on him just because Van is still a child. He then orders one of his men to give the signal for the mage to begin the attack against the village. One of the warriors asks him to be cautious, because they might end up hitting the dragon during the attack. At that moment, Van asks Panamera to carry out the attack. She summons a large number of shurikens and uses that power to defeat the dragon. The man is completely impressed by that display of strength. Van comments that it is the first time he has used that technique, and that, fortunately, everything worked very well. He believes that it represents a threat comparable to the 4 elemental magics. As he observes the situation more carefully, the prince realizes that the king of Scuderia himself is present there. Surprised, he asks what the king is doing in such a distant village. Van then asks whether they still intend to continue fighting. Faced with the situation, all the knights end up giving up. Van performs an attack just to frighten the boy, and the prince decides to retreat. The king is very impressed with the young man. In addition, he and others had already heard that Van had been expelled from home, and now they realized that perhaps no one had truly understood his real potential. The king comments that, when he returns to the royal capital, he will need to review the studies about magical aptitude. During an interrogation, they ask the prince whether he can reveal what his kingdom's plan was. Panamera asks whether it would be necessary to tear out the boy's eyes to make him speak. Frightened by the threat, the boy decides to tell everything. He explains that the kingdom of Reincarnates has been preparing this invasion for many years. The first step of the plan was to attack that village, which belongs to the territory of the Marquis family Ferdio. Because it is an isolated village, they believed it would be easy to conquer it. Panamera begins to laugh, commenting that the plan ended up turning against them. Then they ask whether other places were also being attacked. The boy explains that, at that exact moment, another military force is already attacking the main city. He reveals that the target is Scudetto. Upon hearing that information, everyone realizes that they need to return to the royal capital as quickly as possible. It will be necessary to immediately organize the Order of Knights and depart to defend Scudetto. The king agrees with that idea, but says that he has a request to make. He asks the boy to participate in the defense of Scudetto. Van recognizes that it is a great honor, but he also knows that leaving now from such a distant village could be the same as abandoning it. Even though everyone believes that the village is already quite developed, he believes that there is still much to improve. Van explains that, for him, the village has not even reached 10% of what he intends to build. Panamera begins to laugh and comments that she finds Van very amusing. She is very curious to discover what other surprising things he might still create. Even so, she believes that he should accept the request. In times of national crisis, all nobles must cooperate. That is a commitment assumed when someone receives a title of nobility. Van decides to accept, but he remembers that he also has responsibilities as the lord of those lands. Because of that, he asks that he be allowed to decide how the troop will be formed. The king agrees and leaves the decision completely in his hands. After gathering everyone, Van apologizes for needing to leave at that moment and asks Espada to take care of the village during his absence. Espada accepts, but asks whether Van would not like him to go along as well. Van becomes a little worried, but understands that if Espada leaves too, the village will become vulnerable. So he asks whether Dee and the other knights of the Order of Seat could accompany him. Suddenly, several adventurers appear and say that they will also go along as escorts. In wars like this, they normally do not accept missions, but because it is a request from Van, they decided to help. The boy thanks them very much and promises to pay 5 gold coins to each one. At that moment, Panamera appears saying that she needs to return to report to Count Ferdinand. After that, everyone will gather with the troops and move forward to help Scudetto. Van decides that he will take a weapon, but he still does not know which one to choose. His friend, on the other hand, says that she intends to take a doll. As they depart, Van realizes that this is the first official expedition of the Knights of Seat. The objective of the mission is to defend Scudetto, the largest fortified city in the region. Their opponents are knights from the kingdom of Reincarnates, warriors far more experienced than they are. Van explains that he does not intend to place them on the front lines, because he wants everyone to return alive to the village. As the lord of those lands, he feels that he is responsible for each one of those lives. He promises to do everything possible to protect everyone there. He also asks that each person value their own life. When everything ends safely, they will be able to return and continue working together to develop the village even further. The scene then changes to Marquis Jalpo Paul Ati Ferdio, who is shocked to discover that Scudetto has been attacked by surprise. He knows that facing that kingdom will not be a simple task. Even so, he decides to organize a unit immediately and march to the battlefield. One of the men reports that the village near Scudetto is under the command of Van, who is the son of the Marquis. He comments that the village governed by Van has no soldiers and that its residents can barely secure enough food. At that moment, the butler explains that, according to a merchant who has just arrived from the royal capital, Van received the title of Baron after killing a dragon. The Marquis interrupts the conversation and says that Van does not have the ability to accomplish something like that. Then he orders everyone to stop arguing and to prepare immediately to depart toward the city. The scene changes to Scudetto. When they arrive at the location, they are surprised because they did not expect that the enemy had sent dragons into the battle. Facing that dangerous situation, they decide that the best choice is to retreat as quickly as possible. Suddenly, they realize that they are surrounded by enemy forces. Some begin to wonder whether that might be the end. However, they soon notice that the enemies decided to retreat for some reason. The scene then changes to the girl who controls her dolls. While observing the battlefield, she comments that she did not imagine that Scudetto would be conquered so easily. After analyzing the situation more carefully, Dee believes that the most sensible decision at that moment is to order a retreat, especially because the group is already quite tired and wounded. Van understands the concern, because he also does not want to push anyone beyond their limits. Even so, he believes that if they manage to lure the enemy closer, it might still be possible to provide some kind of support during the retreat. Thinking about this, Van decides to advance a little to buy time while the knights retreat safely. Dee agrees with the plan. Suddenly, a large group of enemy soldiers appears in their path. Even so, fighting together, they manage to defeat a good portion of the opponents. After that, Van asks everyone to retreat immediately. Some believe that they could still continue fighting and perhaps win. But Van insists that no one should continue the battle. For him, they have already managed to gain enough time. More than any victory at that moment, he wants to prevent any of his companions from losing their lives. The scene changes again to Van's father. He decides that, no matter the cost, they must guarantee the retaking of Scudetto. At that moment, the king appears before them. The Marquis apologizes because Scudetto ended up being taken by the enemy. He explains that the knights under his command were attacked by a new weapon used by the enemies, and that practically the entire unit was destroyed. Even so, some managed to retreat, although he still does not know exactly how that was possible. Then someone comments that it was probably thanks to Van. Upon hearing that, the father becomes quite surprised. The Prime Minister then explains that Van managed to strengthen his village, defeated a dragon, and even received a title of nobility despite being so young. The father remains impressed because he had always believed that his son did not possess any magical power. Van's brother clenches his fist tightly when he hears that story. The king then asks whether he is frustrated because Van managed to obtain a title before him. However, the young man replies that, in truth, he feels proud of his brother. The scene returns once again to Van and his companions. Some of them ask what the next step will be. Van answers that, as a noble, he has already fulfilled his duty by helping in the defense. However, he also understands that if Scudetto is not recovered, the kingdom will continue to suffer constant attacks. With that in mind, Van decides to create a new weapon and bring that support directly to the battlefield. For him, simply helping in that way will already be enough to prove that they offered support in the war. Thus, Van begins to develop several new weapons. After finishing the preparations, he decides that everyone will depart early the next morning to help with the recovery of the kingdom. As they continue their journey, he makes it clear how dissatisfied he is with the situation. Even though it is an important mission, delivering new weapons to the fortified city of Scudetto means, in practice, returning to the battlefield, something he clearly does not want. The mere idea of getting involved in direct conflict again bothers him, and the discouragement is evident in his words and in his posture during the trip. For him, that is not just a common mission. It is a return to an environment he would rather avoid. During the journey, one of his companions points to the nearest city to Scudetto. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary place, like so many others in the region. However, as they get closer, the reality reveals itself to be different. The large number of soldiers spread throughout the area clearly indicates that something is happening. The tension is visible. After the last defeat, the army of Scuderia is trying to recover. There is a clear effort to reorganize the forces and regain what was lost. A large part of this change is due to the power of the new weapons from the kingdom of Yeleneta, which have proven to be extremely effective in combat. Upon arriving at the destination, he reunites with his father after a long time. The moment is direct, without great emotional displays, but still filled with respect. His father comments that he heard about his recent feats, including the rumor that he had defeated a dragon. Surprised, he questions whether that is really true. After all, creatures of that level normally require the combined strength of several experienced knights to be defeated. He responds in a simple and straightforward way. He says that it was a forest dragon and that they managed to bring it down using a ballista. The explanation, however, sounds absurd to his father, who shows difficulty in believing that something like that could have been possible. Before the conversation can continue, another important figure appears. It is Panamera, who arrives accompanied by a messenger. She informs them that the king is also present at the location, which completely changes the tone of the situation. The meeting ceases to be merely familial and takes on a more formal and political nature. The protagonist then suggests presenting his ballista. Even before the demonstration, it is already possible to notice the interest of some of those present in the weapon. There is even the possibility of negotiation, depending on the value and effectiveness of the equipment. Even so, the conversation soon shifts direction when they begin to deal with more urgent matters. A meeting is initiated with some of the main figures of the kingdom. The objective is clear: to recapture the city of Scudetto, which was taken by the enemy. During the discussion, they explained that the victory of the kingdom of Yelinetta happened extremely quickly due to two main factors. The first are the wyverns, creatures that allow aerial attacks and guarantee a strategic advantage. The second are the so-called black orbs, a new weapon with impressive destructive power. The combination of these two elements makes defense extremely difficult. The enemy's strategy is based on attacks coming from the sky, something most armies are not prepared to face. Even so, someone suggests that, if they manage to bring down the wyverns quickly, it might be possible to prevent the use of those devastating weapons. The idea, at first glance, seems absurd, something practically impossible. However, at the same time, some recognize that he might be capable of accomplishing something like that, considering his abilities and his inventions. Faced with this, the inevitable question arises: does he intend to fight on the front lines? The answer surprises everyone. He does not want to go. In a direct manner, he states that he prefers to remain in the rear. He does not wish to put himself at risk, even knowing that he could gain recognition and merit in battle. This stance causes immediate indignation among the nobles present. Many consider him arrogant. Others call him a coward, especially because he is only the lord of a small village on the frontier. Even in the face of criticism, he remains calm. Without losing his composure, he explains his position logically. He explains that he took over a village that was on the verge of collapse and that, together with his companions, he managed to develop it little by little. Despite the progress achieved, it is still a small, fragile, and vulnerable territory. If he leaves for war, the village will be left unprotected, and that could be fatal. Then, he reveals something even more concerning. The kingdom of Yelinetta has already sent reconnaissance forces to his region. This completely changes the perspective of the situation. It becomes clear that the enemy does not intend only to conquer large cities, but also to advance gradually, destroying smaller territories in the process. Faced with this, he makes his objective very clear. He does not seek glory. He seeks to protect what he has built. Even so, he does not intend to simply avoid the conflict. Instead, he proposes to contribute in another way. He will prepare new weapons, more efficient ballistas and advanced catapults, designed specifically to face the wyverns and reduce the enemy's aerial advantage. The proposal completely changes the atmosphere of the meeting. The king himself shows interest and confidence in the idea. Without wasting time, he decides to prove his words in practice. To everyone's surprise, he manages to produce a new weapon in a short period of time. The speed with which he works impresses even the most experienced. Some still show distrust, believing that it may be merely something flashy, without real effectiveness in combat. Others, however, recognize the potential. He then explains his strategy. He intends to use catapults to launch special projectiles, capable of striking the wyverns in mid-flight. If he manages to bring them down, the enemy's main advantage will be neutralized. When they ask if that will be enough to guarantee victory, he responds with caution. He cannot promise an absolute result, but he states that he has taken every possible precaution. If the enemy does not have something beyond what is expected, the chances of victory are high. With that, the meeting comes to an end. As everyone begins to prepare for the confrontation, He is thanked for his effort and strategic contribution. They also mention that Art is present at the location, which catches his attention. Soon after, father and son meet again. This time, in a calmer moment, he asks about his mother. The answer brings relief. She is well, living safely within the territory. Even so, there is not much time to rest. The war is approaching quickly, and everyone needs to prepare. They agree to talk again when everything is calmer. The atmosphere is still tense, but there is a brief moment of relief between them. Shortly after, someone notices that Art does not seem well. Concerned, they ask if she should not rest. She apologizes, showing some fatigue, and immediately someone accompanies her so she can recover properly. Meanwhile, the preparations continue without interruption. They decide to leave the troops resting under Kamzan's responsibility, ensuring that they are ready for the right moment. There is confidence in the weapons created by Van, and everyone believes that, when the battle begins, he will be able to prove the true power of his inventions. The strategy is clear. The only effective way to defeat the Wyverns is by using the catapults. Therefore, the Throne Knights are tasked with escorting Kamzan and his men. Others also volunteer to participate, further reinforcing the group. Everyone recognizes that this will be the decisive battle. Yeleneta managed to easily conquer a fortress that was once considered practically impossible to take. This was only possible thanks to the Wyverns and the new weapons. It becomes evident that the era in which battles were decided solely by the magic of the four elements has come to an end. Now, power lies in the hands of those who possess the best weapons. And at this moment, there are two possibilities: either the kingdom of Yeleneta, or the weapons created by that young man. Without wasting time, the operation begins. The troops advance according to the plan, dividing into groups for infiltration. The main objective is to eliminate the Wyverns and weaken the enemy. Each unit receives its role in a well-defined manner, ensuring that everyone knows exactly what to do at the right moment. Some act as skirmishers, moving with agility to provide support in the most vulnerable areas of the battlefield, while others remain in strategic positions, protecting the troops that are still resting and waiting for the moment to enter the action. On the other side, the enemy army carefully observes every movement. They analyze the opposing formation and try to predict what the next step will be. At first, they believe that the attack will be directed straight at the gates, a common strategy in confrontations of this type. However, that expectation soon proves to be wrong. They end up being caught by surprise. The battle begins with an intense exchange of attacks. Arrows cut through the air at high speed. Projectiles are launched with force, and spells begin to emerge from all sides. Shields are quickly raised, and improvised structures help block part of the enemy attacks, reducing the initial damage. Even so, the defense is not perfect. The mages enter into action. They cast powerful spells that manage to pass through some of the barriers, striking directly at the opposing lines. The impact of these spells creates openings and further increases the chaos on the battlefield. Suddenly, new attacks arise from unexpected directions. It becomes evident that both sides had already anticipated different scenarios and were prepared to react to various possibilities. It is not just about brute force, but also about strategy. Yeleneta's elite enters the action, a highly trained group, with discipline and strength above average, that quickly moves to surround the soldiers of Scuderia. In just a few moments, they manage to put them at a disadvantage, pressuring them from all sides. The situation becomes critical. It is at this moment that reinforcements arrive. Subordinates of Ban appear on the battlefield and take over part of the combat, relieving the pressure on the main troops. Thanks to this, the soldiers manage to reorganize, catch their breath, and regain their strategic positions. In addition, they bring an important warning. Long-range attacks are still being prepared. The danger is far from over. Soon after, something even more threatening appears in the sky. Wyverns, and not just one or two. Several of them appear at the same time, flying over the battlefield and casting a threatening shadow over everyone. The presence of these creatures completely changes the dynamics of the confrontation. The enemy prepares its final attack. The intention is clear: to use the black orbs again to destroy everything at once and secure definitive victory. But this time, the situation is different. Everything had already been anticipated. The catapults are carefully positioned, aligned, and ready for the exact moment. The soldiers wait for the command, maintaining their focus even under increasing pressure. Then, the order is given. Fire. The special projectiles are launched with impressive precision, cutting through the sky and striking the wyverns while they are still in the air. The impact is immediate, and several of the creatures are brought down before they can even attack. The strategy works exactly as planned. Even those that manage to survive the first strike do not have time to react. The ballistas move into action immediately afterward. With fast and accurate shots, they finish off what remains of the creatures, preventing any counterattack. In just a few moments, the aerial threat is completely neutralized. Yeleneda's main force is destroyed. The turning point in the battle is immediate. Without the wyverns and without the possibility of using the black orbs, the enemy army loses its greatest advantage. The organization begins to fail, and what once seemed like a coordinated attack turns into disorder. The collapse is inevitable. Victory is achieved. Even so, many are still impressed by the outcome. The power of the weapons created by Van exceeded all expectations, proving that strategy and innovation can completely change the course of a war. After the end of the combat, the survivors begin to gather. There is a collective feeling of relief upon realizing that many managed to come out unharmed. Some still try to process what happened, while others simply rest after the extreme effort. At that moment, one of the soldiers approaches with important information. They captured Yeleneda's commander. The news immediately shifts the focus of the situation. With him in their hands, there is the possibility of obtaining valuable information about the enemy's next plans. During the interrogation, something concerning is revealed. The enemy plan was not limited to that battle. In fact, they intended to attack 3 different locations at the same time, dividing their forces to cause the maximum possible impact. 2 of these targets were already known, Sidamura and Skudit, but the third catches everyone completely by surprise. The House of Ferdinand, the place where art was born. The revelation completely changes the atmosphere. Even after a great victory, a new threat emerges on the horizon, reminding everyone that the war is still far from over.